Singapore Democratic Party.
The Singapore Democratic Party.
Singapore Democratic Party is seeking to impress on voters quality over quantity in Parliament.
How does SDP set itself apart from other parties?
SDP is known for pushing the boundaries. The party who dares to stand up and who will ask the difficult questions in Parliament. We value people over profits. We are viewed as the party with the guts.
What are some of the key issues that you guys will be looking at?
The cost of living is just dragging people down. That's something which really should not be the case. It's very hard to prove that you're competent when you're never given the chance. We don't give up. We keep trying. This is the Singapore of our friends, our family. If you're happy with the way things are right now, then vote PAP. But if you think we should do something different, then you should vote for the alternative party.
Welcome back to Political Prude's GE2025 special, where we're putting together content that helps all of us get ready to vote. Now, as promised, we're doing one dedicated episode per party. Now, think of this as a quick but thorough briefing to help all of us get to know each political party contesting in this GE. This is not just about giving them airtime, but also to hold space to understand who they are, what they stand for, and where they're headed. Now, this episode, we're spotlighting the Singapore Democratic Party, the SDP. It was founded in 1980 by Chiam See Tong with the aim to be a credible opposition voice and to champion democracy as well as social justice. He became the party's first member of parliament in 1984 when he was elected in the constituency of Potong Pasir. Two other SDP candidates were elected to parliament in 1991. However, following internal disputes and subsequent electoral defeats, the party lost all its parliamentary representation in the 1997 GE and has been striving to win a seat back ever since. The party has gone through significant leadership transitions, most notably with Dr. Chee Juan taking over the reins in 1993, shaping the SDP into the party we know today for its bold policy proposals, civil liberties advocacy, as well as notable opposition voice. This GE 2025, the SDP has launched an early campaign centered around what they call a Northern strategy, laying claim to constituencies like Bukit Panjang SMC, the new Sembawang West SMC, Sembawang GRC, and potentially more in the region as well. I'm super excited to share that joining us today is the chairman of SDP himself, Dr. Paul Tambyah. He will help introduce us to the party and also break down their plans for the upcoming elections. I hope you enjoy this episode. Dr. Paul, welcome to Political Prude, the podcast.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Great.
So let me just begin by explaining the context of this episode.
Sure.
I think a lot of the audience today just wants to get to know the party a little bit better. The audience you're speaking to today doesn't really, maybe follow politics all the time, but they also want to make informed votes, right? So what they're hoping to maybe achieve out of this episode is to maybe understand, how does SDP set itself apart from other parties? And what does the SDP stand for really? So I would maybe start off by saying that if I ask anyone, today, from my peers or whatnot, what do they think of SDP? I think most of them will just say, oh, that's the Chee Juan party.
Seriously,
right?
your peers? So you look younger than that.
I look younger than that.
That's what people my mom's generation say.
Right. But, I think there's obviously way more to the party. So if I was to ask you, how would you explain the SDP to someone with no prior knowledge to Singapore politics? How would you explain the party?
SDP is known for pushing the boundaries in terms of communications, in terms of outreach, and in terms of the issues that are kind of on the margins. So for someone who's familiar with politics, we are left of centre party. And I think we're probably more left than any other political party in Singapore. We've got several of the ex-ISA detainees who have stood as SDP candidates in the past, including Teo So Lang and Wong Suk Yi. We have embraced the activists. It's not always easy to work with activists because, they're very concerned about certain issues and sometimes they are disappointed in us. And the reality is that we're a political party, although my wife thinks I'm more of an activist than a politician. our tagline, is caring, compassionate, constructive. And I think each of those represents the elements which represent the SDP. So caring, we are very much a social democratic party. So we believe in universal housing, universal healthcare, universal education, that these are kind of basic human rights that everybody should have. In terms of compassionate, that's the reach out to the marginalized. We've spoken up for migrant workers. We've spoken up against the death penalty for the very poor, for the elderly, for the disabled, and constructive. And this is where I think we are known to people on the fringes of the political scene, is that we are the only party with a comprehensive suite of policies. We've got an education policy, a healthcare policy, a housing policy, immigration policy, cost of living policy. We even have a Malay community policy, climate policy. So these are all things that we put together over the years.
Earlier on, you mentioned that the SDP is more left than
Right.
most of the other parties. For people who don't follow politics, they might not be very aware of what does
Right.
left, what does right mean. So maybe you can help us communicate that.
Yeah, in simple terms, the left tends to view the rights of the individual, the rights of those. The idea is that you take care of everybody, and it's one way of looking at it is this is the bottom-up approach. So you take care of the bottom, and you slowly build up. You allow people the opportunity to thrive, to flourish, to do well. You give everybody an equal opportunity to start at the same starting point. Some will do better, some will not. The right, on the other hand, is this trickle-down idea. You identify the best people, you give them the most resources, and maybe those at the bottom will get some benefits in the end. That's a bit of a caricature, but that's the way that those of us on the left see it. You either come from the ground up or from the top down. So we're very much the ground up party.
For a lot of us, we hear things like, okay, you should align yourself to a party or vote for a party that speaks for the values that you hold. How would you describe the SDP's values?
Yeah, so I like that because SDP's values are very clearly defined. And that's the reason why I went to the SDP in the first place. The SDP, as I mentioned, is very much a left of center party. So that means we value people over profits. And we focus on human rights. And we expand the definition of human rights. Human rights doesn't just mean the right to stand in front of parliament and have your voice heard. It includes everything. It includes the right to a dignified life. It includes the right to decent housing for everyone, the right to a basic healthcare, the right to an equal opportunity in terms of education. So those are the kind of values that the SDP feels are important. And while the overall GDP may appear lower if you redistribute the economic benefits to everybody, including the low income and the low middle income population, we think that that's a price that people are willing to pay. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence for that. If you look at the United States and the United Kingdom, the time when they did really well was in the 1960s and 70s, when the top marginal income tax rate was 60-70%. And that was before the Reagan and Thatcher era. And the whole country benefited because there was a lot of redistribution. There was a lot of infrastructure building. They built highways, they built schools, they built resources, and everybody came up instead of just giving to the top and waiting for it to trickle down. So I think if you kind of believe that, and it doesn't matter where you are. See, I have to admit it, I'm fairly privileged. I grew up in a middle-class family. My dad was a physician, and so I had a lot of opportunities. But still, there was something not quite right about just trying to get more for myself. And I realized that, life is a lot more fun if everybody else has the same kind of opportunities. They may not have exactly the same kind of opportunities, but at least if they have similar opportunities to what I had.
For a lot of the audience, when we talk about the opposition,
Right.
There's this tendency to just group all of them together, right? Like as I get myself more prepared or get ready for the elections, what I realize is that every party has kind of its own character, its own personalities, its own priorities as well. If you were to say, how SDP differs from other parties out there, what would you say are the key features that are more USP,
Well, I think the main thing is that we're viewed as the party with the guts. The party who dares to stand up and who will ask the difficult questions in Parliament. And we've proven this time and again from the time of Dr. Chee, right from the very beginning. Before social media, they were out there calling on people to return our CPF, to deal with the cost of living. And so there are many things that we have actually stood up for. Many parties have also got similar concerns. I mean, these concerns like cost of living are concerns for every Singaporean, but it's the way you do it. And that's the other nice thing about the creatives in SDP. They're very creative. We were the first people to come out with a party political podcast 20 years ago. Then it got banned. Then we were the first people to have a humorous political ad, and that got banned. Even in the last general election, we tried to do Google ads and they got banned. Even though it's not so much a two-sided thing, but the Singaporean public tends to see it as a two-sided thing, which is why they keep asking us to avoid three-cornered fights, because they want a clear choice between the PAP and some other opposition party, but not two or three other opposition parties, even though I don't think there's anything wrong with having two or three opposition parties in one particular constituency. And so what I would say to the voter is, if you're happy with the way things are right now, if you think you're getting a fair deal, if you think the current system, which is, in my mind, super elitist and, very much focused on multinationals and bringing in the finance industry, and sort of as an afterthought is providing handouts to the general public, then vote PAP. But if you think we should do something different, then you should vote for the alternative party, and which is why it would be good to have two or three parties in there. But in reality, most people are only going to have one alternative party to choose from. So it's either, more of the same high cost of living and a little bit of handouts here and there, or party XYZ, depending where you live. If you're really lucky, you live in Sembawang or Bukit Panjang, you can vote for the SDP.
I think for a lot of the voters who are not very much engaged, right? I think they want to prioritize people who are able to do the job, right? That's just something that keeps popping up in conversations that I have. They say, actually, I don't really know anything about these people. It seems like the PAP's got capable people. I'll just vote for that. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting idea in that Singapore has become more and more of a corporation, which is run by technocrats. The first generation of PAP leaders, they came from all walks of life. We had seamstresses, we had factory workers, we had dock workers, and they did a tremendous job in the 1960s of building up Singapore. There were some technocrats like Goh Keng Swee and Hon Swee Sen and E.W. Barker and, of course, Lee Kuan Yew, who was a lawyer. But by and large, the people who were really mobilizing the PAP were the unionists. There were people in the trade unions. And so I don't think that, just because you're a general or you're a senior civil servant or permanent secretary means that you're going to be better as a politician. Because politics is very different. This is something I've learned. As a professor, it's very, very different from being a politician. Because you have to listen to people, you have to understand all the different angles, the different implications. Of course, some of that is true in research and teaching, but it's magnified on a much larger scale in politics. So I would say, yes, of course, you need to have competent individuals. But, a lot of people learn on the job and they grow into their roles. And we've seen that with some of the PAP leaders who've been parachuted in. Some of them make it, some of them don't. It doesn't matter what qualifications they have from the beginning. In the 1970s, the PAP brought in a lot of academics. And actually, very few of them actually made it. Because they tended to have a very academic approach to leadership and to government. And so they switched, and then they started bringing in civil servants, and then they started bringing in people from the military. And now we've gone back to bringing in civil servants. So I think, it's good to have competent individuals, but it's very hard to prove that you're competent in running a town council or speaking up in parliament when you're never given the chance. So the voters have to sort of estimate based on how they do in a debate, and how they run their campaign. And this is one of the things that stands out for the SDP. If you come for any of our events, they're so well organized. People talk about the SDP machinery. Even at very short notice, you can see we can put together a pretty well-oiled machinery to generate an event. And that gives you a bit of confidence that, your town council is not going to fall apart. Because if they can put together an event like that, they should be able to do a decent town council.
So early on, you mentioned the idea of parachuting. I think that's quite a politics term.
Right.
So a lot of our audience might not understand that. So maybe you could just explain that for them.
Yeah. So basically, parachuting means that you bring in somebody who is obviously very highly qualified, but he or she has been in the civil service or in the military, which are by definition apolitical. So in other words, this person has never been in politics at all, has never taken part in any political activity at all. And then 2 weeks before the election, he's brought in as a candidate. And he's expected to stand and to become a member of parliament. So that's what we mean by parachuting. And again, this is probably exemplifies the idea of top down versus ground up. This is from very high up. They come from a plane and they land in the constituency. Whereas the people that we have in general, none of them are actually senior civil servants as such. But they are people from all walks of life who have come forward as change makers, as volunteers. They've been involved. Some of them have come from outside the party, but they have essentially got their feet on the ground. So they haven't just been brought in for the election.
And when you talk about like the SDP machinery, right? Obviously, when you have to kind of screen who comes into the party as well and who you'll be fielding as candidates. What is the thought process like when choosing the people to represent SDP?
Yeah, so many people come forward. We obviously ask them to come forward and volunteer, be a change maker first, long before they become a member. And the key thing with the SDP has got to be its values. So if these individuals share our values, and if they show that they share our values, from the way they interact with the public, the way they interact with other members, then we get them involved in what we call the party organizing departments, and they depending on their talents or their inclinations. If they're good with social media, we get them involved in branding and communications. If they're good with on the ground, we get them involved in ground operations. And then we give them a chance, we get them responsibility, we see how they perform. And it's kind of like you would do in any organization. And the thing about this is it's a democratic party. And people can see who is doing work and who has got the skills and the ability, and then they eventually will bubble up.
Other opposition parties, like for example WP and PSP, we've seen them speak in parliament, and we kind of know what are some of the things that they will push for. So, like speaking hypothetically, if you guys were given the opportunity to have representation in parliament, what are some of the key issues that you guys will be looking at?
Yeah, I'm of course hoping this is not going to be hypothetical, that we will be in parliament very soon. But for myself personally, the reason why I got into politics was healthcare. So that's going to be right up there, front and center. But cost of living is an issue which we keep hearing time and again. The cost of living is just dragging people down because the rents, the utilities fees and all these things that they pay, which are actually within the control of the government. There's a global inflation, okay, fair enough. But on top of that, the government went and raised the GST, which is like rubbing salt into the wound. So these are issues that we're definitely going to bring up. And, we've already brought them up. Even from outside Parliament, we've raised up these issues through our policies, through various forums that we've held, through the press statements that we've issued. And so I think people have a clear, relatively good idea of where we stand on the major issues.
And, when it comes to like the GE coming up, I think we've all now heard the news, the strategy of going up north. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, so, the Election Boundaries Review Committee just came out with this report with really very little detailed explanation as to why they did it. They said there were population changes, and then Bukit Batok disappeared, and there doesn't seem to be any logical reason for that. And that was an area where the SDP had been working the ground for close to 10 years. We gotten to know people. We show up in the neighborhoods. Dr. Chee is already a familiar face in many of the coffee shops and And so we really had to consolidate our resources because we don't have a lot of resources. We don't have, a multi-million-dollar People's Association backing us up with all the grassroots organizations. We don't have the state-owned media, covering every little action that we do. Opening a bus stop or a vending machine, doesn't appear in the in a mass circulation news portal. So basically, we had to concentrate our resources. And Sembawang is a place where we've been since 2006. We did fairly well in Marsiling UT. And when Sembawang West SMC was carved out of Sembawang, we looked at all the other SMCs. And, every SMC is a PAP stronghold. Because these are areas, they have access to the voting data. We have access to the voting data, but we can't set the boundaries. Every elections when they have at the counting center, the returning officer will announce for which polling districts what were the results. So both the PAP and the opposition, they have an idea of which are the areas which tend to support them a bit more. And of course, the head of the Election Boundaries Review Committee is the Prime Minister's secretary. It's the Secretary General of the PAP. So basically, we have to work within the framework or the resources that we're given. And having said that, we came to the conclusion that Sembawang area we've been, 2022, we went and we planted our flag. In fact, Ong Ye Kung responded he picked it up very quickly how we had staked a claim to Sembawang way back in 2022. And when Sembawang West opened up, then that seemed to be a natural place to go.
You guys were among the first party to announce where you guys wanted to go after. Like, do you think that will benefit the party?
Well, there was a lot of discussion about that. But again, the SDP is always the first. It's almost always the first for a lot of things. And I think, I was a bit skeptical about this because, the last general election, we pulled the switch right on nomination day because I was originally planning to go to Holland Bukit Timah. And then there was this COVID election and we were really thinking that we were going to get wiped out. And then a couple of our CC members came up with the idea of pulling a switch between me and Wayin. And that turned out to be quite beneficial. But the consensus was, let's just be very clear and upfront about where we're going, because that will allow us to go in full swing. If you're not sure where you're going to spend a lot of time and energy flying like 2 or 3 different GRCs and SMCs. But this allowed us every single household in Sembawang West has received a SDP flyer. And by the end of the next couple of weeks, practically every single household in Sembawang GRC will have received an SDP flyer. And we'll be moving on to the other contiguous SMCs and GRCs. So I think, like I said, I was not originally that supportive, but now I see the wisdom of that approach. And I think it makes sense because, logistically, Sembawang is a huge constituency. You travel from one end to the other. It can take you quite a long time. So if we had, someone in Sembawang and someone way down in the south or in the east, we'd just spend more time in traffic than talking to people.
That's fair. And, with every election strategy or campaign, there will be obviously some key messages that we want to put out.
Right.
So for a younger voter, what are some of the key messages that maybe would appeal to them a little more?
Well, like I said, the key message has always been, the cost of living. The cost of living needs to come down because it's actually become really pretty unbearable and very difficult for people in Singapore. You hear all these stories about side hustles. Side hustles is a romanticized way of calling it if somebody has to work 2 jobs to just keep, food on the table or to pay off the mortgage. And it's just become glamorized into a side hustle. But the reality is that that's what young people are facing today. I run tutorials for students who struggle in the university. And I've come to the conclusion, actually, that there's only 3 reasons why they struggle. The first reason is some undiagnosed mental health issue. And sometimes, there's so much stigma that people are not willing to talk about it. So I sit this person down in the room and I say, look, we can try and get you a referral. We'll do it confidentially. We won't go on your record. I know a couple of very discreet psychiatrists or counselors and they'll help you out. Second reason, they're doing something they didn't want to do. They're doing it because their parents made them do it. Yeah. So that one's really hard to deal with, but sometimes we can tell them, okay, look, we'll find a way out. And if it's not one or two, I simply turn around and ask them, I said, how many hours of tuition are you doing a week? And some of them are giving 40 hours of tuition a week. And it's no wonder they're struggling with their university studies because they're having to keep up with the tuition students' homework or set assignments for their students. And you ask them why they're doing it. It's very simple. It's very obvious. They look at me as though I'm an idiot when I ask them a question like that. It's obvious they're doing it because their family needs the money. See, and that's something which really should not be the case. So there is financial aid which pays the school fees, but it's all the other parts of it. It's the cost of living. Some of them have come from single parent homes, or they have younger siblings who they have to support, and all those things don't count in the calculation of the financial aid. So it's I mean, there is a per capita income thing, but these people are already at the low end of the per capita income, and so that's why they're forced to spend hours giving tuition, and that's got an impact on them. And it's the same in many other industries where young people are forced to work overtime or to do stuff, just to make ends meet or to support their families.
Mm-hmm. And, for the audience, there are some who have voted previously in GE 2020, and I guess they would have their own impressions of, the SDP back then. What would you say has maybe changed or is different about, the SDP's strategy or communications this time around?
Well, GE 2020 was a very unusual election in that it was a COVID election. So there were no rallies. And, the last political rallies were in 2015. And rallies are really electric events. You see all these people coming together from all over the place. You get a chance to hear the politicians. You get a chance to talk to them after they've had their speeches. And the other thing is that the people don't often appreciate this. But, in 2020, when we did these electronic rallies, we get 20,000 viewers, 30,000 viewers. And a good day, we get 40,000 viewers. When you have a rally and it's covered by Channel News Asia or Straits Times, you get 500,000 views. You get 600,000 views because their platforms have got such a huge reach. So you get your message across far more effectively. And at the rallies, you also have booths where you sell merchandise. So that helps with the fundraising, helps with volunteer mobilization. So I think, going back to having rallies, having in-person opportunities to meet with the residents, because we do our house visits, we do our market walkabouts, but you interact with a relatively limited number of people. At the rally, you're there. Anyone who wants to come and see you, wants to come and hear you, they can come.
Actually, for me, this will be my first time attending a rally, so I'm quite excited.
I thought so.
Yeah, and I'm like, okay. So my question to you is, if you were to maybe pitch to a young person, like why should they, come out of their house to attend an SDP rally versus watching their favorite show on Netflix at home?
Right.
I think a lot of them would probably choose the latter. But what is that key thing that they should know about to get them to get out of the house and attend a rally?
Well, it's a rare opportunity. Like I said, it's once in 10 years, that we've had this opportunity to attend a rally. The presidential election, there were no rallies. 2017, we were robbed of a presidential election. So it's 2015 and now. So this is an opportunity to hear from somebody who actually wants your vote. So this is somebody who's going to speak to you and tell you, what his or her vision is for the next 5 years for Singapore, and tell you whether you should, just vote for the status quo or whether you should take a risk. Because it is taking a risk, except of course in Aljunied and Sengkang, where there's already a known entity of the WP, but and Hougang. But for the rest of Singaporeans, they're actually taking a risk because you've had the PAP running your constituency for the last 60 years. And then now you're trying to take a risk on somebody. So if you want to take a risk like that, you really need to know what you're taking a risk on. And so that's the reason to go to a rally. You can go on social media, you can, but there's so many filters and things that when in a rally, that's face to face. That you can't hide. You're up there with all the spotlights on you, and you can't run away.
For those who have, no idea what to expect at a
Right.
rally, other than speeches, like how would you describe it to them?
Yeah, so they're really strict here. You can only do speeches at rallies. You're not allowed to do music. About 2011, I think it was Vincent Vijayasingh's birthday. And so at one of the rallies, we brought out a cake and started singing Happy Birthday. And then we got a police warning. You're not allowed to provide entertainment. You all sang Happy Birthday at a rally. So, okay, this is Singapore, So you just go by the book. So all we're allowed to do is to have speeches, no happy birthdays.
Okay. But the attendees will be able to interact with the parties?
Yes, because, and this is one of the things that we do in the SDP. I know in some of the PAP rallies and some of the other parties, they have everybody sitting on stage. But we generally have just a speaker on stage. And there's a good reason for that. You see, because we have that area outside where it's like a mosh pit, but you're not allowed to get in and throw yourself in. But at least we can talk over the barriers. And we actually do a lot of interactions with people at that kind of situation.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt this episode, but before we jump right back in, do me a favor, drop a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button. It takes 2 seconds, but it actually makes a huge difference in letting more people discover these conversations. Now, let's get back to it. Outside of, the rallies,
Right.
I think a lot of the audience would maybe have a deeper understanding of the SDP through one, going to the website, going to social media pages. And I think the one that everybody keeps telling us voters to look at is the manifestos.
Right.
So I'm hoping to also discuss a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
What can you share about, the manifesto this time around?
Yeah, so again, the focus of the manifesto is going to be on the cost of living, but it goes just beyond cost of living, and it looks at everything that is getting Singaporeans down. See, there's a lot of stress. I talked about mental health. That's a major issue, and a lot of the stress is because we're so crowded. My wife and I think I've said this before. We have no kids, so every time there's a long weekend, we stay in Singapore because 1 million people leave the country, and Singapore is so much more livable. The malls are less crowded, the restaurants are less busy. So you can get by like that. So that's kind of one of the things that we're talking about, is to try and reduce the stress level. And reducing stress level is really super difficult to do for 5 million people. But there are certain things you can do to prevent the stress level from building up. And one of them is reducing the overcrowding. So that's one of the things that's going to be a key plank is we're not against immigration, but we want more calibrated immigration, and we want it to focus on people who care about Singapore. We want to have people who have close connections with Singapore, rather than just bring in people to drive down wages, which appears to be the current policy. And then things that people worry about. See, people worry about the big ticket items. The most expensive thing that anyone ever buys anywhere in the world is your house. So if you are in a situation where you spend your entire retirement savings, which is your CPF, to buy your house, then, you may think that you've covered it all. But then when you get close to retirement, you realize you've got nothing in your CPF because it's all there in the house. Then what are you going to do? You're going to downsize. But by that time, the price of the housing has gone up, so you're really in a fix. So for those in their 40s and late 30s, early 50s, you really got to start thinking about what to do with that. And that's a particular problem with this issue of lease decay. Because some of the flats in Queenstown are 60 years old. There are flats in MacPherson, and sooner or later, in the next 10, 15 years, the flats in Ang Mo Kio, the flats in Bedok are going to reach the magic number of 79 years. And once your flat is 79 years old, the buyer cannot use CPF to buy your flat. So the value of your flat is going to go to zero. And if you've put your entire life savings through your CPF into your flat, then you're stuck. You're going to literally have to work until you die. So housing, cost of living, overpopulation, and then of course healthcare. And that's a field which I know the most about, because healthcare is extraordinarily stressful in Singapore because people are so worried that something's going to go wrong. They try very hard to take care of your health. But But then you hear these stories about young people getting cancer and getting a heart attack or getting a stroke with no prior history. And this is something which is in everybody's mind because there are all these limitations to the way healthcare is financed, the way insurance companies are allowed to restrict the healthcare, even for people who have been long-term customers of their insurance policies. And then finally, education. Singaporean students have reported that they're amongst the most stressed in the world. So even though they do well in these standardized tests, but they really don't get a chance to enjoy a childhood or youth. A lot of things that we did when we were kids, these kids nowadays don't do anymore. You have to be on the school team, otherwise you cannot play soccer or rugby or hockey or something like that. They're just so restricted, and this whole DSA thing seems to have completely bounced back on individuals. Originally, the idea was to have a DSA so that kids who have some talent they get a chance to get in, even if they're academically not so strong. And then what you find is that only 5% of the kids in DSA are from low-income households. So what does that tell you? People are getting tuition. So this is just hot housing these kids, and it takes the fun out of growing up, and it actually increases the stress. So these are all things that are going to appear in our campaign message and in our manifesto.
Maybe you can share with us what is the strategy or methods in which you guys are reaching out to young voters?
Well, getting our message across has been through social media. And so we are active on all the platforms that young people use. But I think far and above everything else, young people look for authenticity. They want to see someone who's not a fake, who's not putting on a wayang, who is what he or she says that he is. That is something that we're hoping to get across. We get so many young volunteers who come forward. I'll be honest, though, they have a relatively short attention span. So sometimes after a while, they find something else that they're interested in. And that's fine, because they bring some energy to the campaign. They encourage those of us, who've been there and done that many years ago. And they keep us young in that sense. So we're hoping that, all the young change makers, as we call them, they come forward, they help us out, they get tired or they want to do something else or they have to, some exam coming up or something like that. But at least they leave us with an idea of what we stand for. And they can tell their friends, they can tell their relatives, they can tell their akong, ama, that Dr. Chee is not this madman that you've been told 50 years ago, 30 years ago.
You mentioned this madman impression, right? There are still people who feel like that.
Oh, yes.
For me, it's like I changed my opinion once I started watching content of his, right? And whether it's TikTok or on other podcast interviews. And I'm like, okay, I see a different side to him than maybe what I was told he was like. My question to you is like, for people who maybe still have, like young people who still have that impression, like how would you maybe tell them what he's really like?
Yeah, I think what has to happen is that they have to see for themselves. And that's the beauty of social media, is that you get a chance to see for yourself. Because you get a chance to interact with him on IG or when we have these discussions and things like that. But you get to see his TikToks and I think I've said this before a couple of times. The moment to me was 2015, before the general election. I remember I was in outside one of the MRT stations and I saw him selling his books and people, they walk across on the other side. Then barely a couple of weeks later, the election has started, or a couple of months later, and he's at this boat key rally, and people are lining up for 1.5 hours to get him to sign the book. It's different people. I mean, they're mostly younger people, but once people got to hear him unfiltered, without the lens of the PAP trying to portray him as a madman, then they realized that, hey, he's very passionate. And sometimes in Singapore, passion is viewed as being crazy. See, but he's very passionate and very committed to the whole concept of human rights and the social goods that he talks about.
I do have a personal question about your entry into politics, and I guess it's because when I listen to a lot of people's starting out journeys, they talk about the different options they have. One of it is obviously to join the PAP and make the change from within. And the other option, I guess, is to look at the opposition parties out there. So my question, and what I'm curious about, is really why the SDP among all the other options you had?
Yeah, a lot of people ask me this question.
Okay.
So, in reality, I did try and change the system from within, from very early on. And I think that's probably the way I was brought up. My parents taught us to ask questions and to think about what we're doing and not to accept, things just as the way they were. And so I used to go for all these forums and feedback sessions, and I used to give feedback, and it got to be almost a joke in the university and the Ministry of Health that, in Singapore, people rarely like to ask questions. So the chairman would look around the room and he'd say, Paul, okay, so do you have a question? And I'd feel kind of obliged to ask a question. And I would ask a question, and then after that, other people would ask questions. But you find that asking questions didn't do anything. It helped you feel good that you were bringing up an issue or something that was not right. And people would come up to me after that and say, "Oh yeah, and thank you for bringing that up." But nothing changes. And then a few years ago, I mean, it's about 20 years ago, Goh Chok Tong, he famously told Catherine Lim that if you want to make a difference in Singapore, you have to get involved in politics. He was upset at a commentary that she had written for, I think it was an academic journal. And so that actually made sense. Like my mom asked me, she said, "Why do you want to go into politics?" And I said, "Look, I keep asking these questions and they keep getting ignored, or I get fobbed off. And I said, if I go in parliament and ask a question, they have to answer. They may not answer the question I'm asking, and sometimes you have to ask the same question 3-4 times. That's what Gerald Giam has had to do. He's asked this question about the MediShield Life loss ratio, and he had to practically ask the question again and again to drill down to get a straight answer. But eventually he got an answer. So that's what I wanted. See, I wanted to be able to really make a difference in a concrete way. In a way, I kind of followed Goh Chok Tong's advice, and I went into politics in that sense. And then the question of why SDP. So I attended a number of events by various parties, and SDP seemed most aligned to my values. The idea that healthcare, housing are fundamental human rights. And that these are something that everybody should have. It doesn't matter whether your parents are rich or your parents are poor. You should have the same access to decent housing. So there's an equalization.
You mentioned wanting to join politics in order to make a difference, right? I would also describe myself as quite passionate about topics that I feel, strongly about. When the topic of okay, then why don't you enter, or why don't you join a party? For me, it's I feel like I can do things in my own way. And one of the push factor for me not wanting to join politics is the idea of being under the public eye, or and then if let's say you join an opposition party, I feel like there's still a little bit of a stigma, right? Like why would I want to put myself through that?
No, that's a very good question, and it's very real. And I think I'll take it in reverse order to the way you brought it up, because this question always comes up. If you're an opposition politician, we've had, when we had our healthcare policy in 2012. We had a whole bunch of doctors who came forward, general practitioners, specialists. And then when we revised it, I said, can we do a public launch? And not one of them was willing to be seen. And what had happened was, in between, a lot of things had happened. The government had cracked down on a lot of things, one of which was really quite crazy. All the anesthetists, these are the people who put you to sleep when you go for surgery. Because what had happened was the government had raised the personal income tax, but they lowered the corporate income tax. So these anesthetists converted themselves into corporations. It's a bit complicated, but basically the income tax people started going after them. So every anesthetist in private practice in Singapore who basically worked from home was charged with, was accused of being trying to evade taxes. So all the doctors started to panic, and they started thinking, look, I haven't been 120% squeaky clean in my taxes, and if I go into the opposition, they're going to go through my taxes for the last 10 years. And so they panicked. They just didn't want to be seen. They contributed, but behind the scenes. So I think that is a very real fear. And I think part of the reason why people are afraid of this is the way the PAP has painted themselves. And it's got to do with this all-white uniform. See, you portray yourself as being whiter than white. You're totally incorruptible. But people recognize that nobody is perfect. See? Every individual will make mistakes here and there. And the key is to admit that you made a mistake. When you made a mistake, you admit that you make a mistake and what you've learned from that mistake. So in fact, I've talked about this before as well. The COVID After Action Review was a truly unique document in Singapore's political history, because it was the first time in recent memory for most of us that the PAP government actually admitted that there were things that they could have done better. which is kind of a normal thing that most people would do. But it just seems so alien to their normal way of doing things. And I'd like to think that those of us in the SDP had something to do with that, because we kept pointing out things that they had done well, but things that they could definitely have done a lot better. So they responded to that in their white paper, or they responded to just the general public. I won't be so conceited to think there was only us, but there was a wide clamor from the general public, which recognized that things could be done better. So if you set yourself up as somebody who is perfect, who doesn't make mistakes, then of course you're going to be afraid of the public scrutiny. But if you are somebody who, is honest and recognizes that there are things that you do well, but there are things that you don't do that well, then I think the pressure is not so great, because you don't have to maintain a level of perfection. You maintain a level of being a decent human being. You maintain the level of respecting the people around you. Of course, if you're, what I won't use the word, but that you're nasty to the people you work with, then you have no place in politics. And ideally, you shouldn't be. These are the kind of people who contribute to toxic workplaces. So that's the second part, the part about the public scrutiny. So why put myself through that? So in a way, it's also related to the fact that I'm in a relatively privileged position. Because when I got my tenure, the former vice chancellor came up to me and he said, now you've got to find something to aspire to or something to look forward to. And he never imagined that I was going to run as an opposition candidate. But, it's the idea that I was looking for a fresh challenge. And I realized that, I benefited a lot from the opportunities that have been given to me, mainly because of my parents, but also because of the system. Although I did take 6 years of leave from the system to go to the States, and I had great mentors over there, and I learned a lot. And it's time to give back in a way that's not easy, but a way that's hard. Like I said, I had sort of the bases sort of covered at that point in time. So I was willing to take that risk. And I've enjoyed it. I mean, it's been a great ride the last 15 years.
That's a long time for someone to be, in politics.
Right.
I guess what I want to ask now is kind of the future of the party as well. Over the 15 years, I'm sure you've witnessed a lot of young people coming forward to, volunteer with the party or join the party, or even just showing their support for the party. I'm curious as to how you would define this demographic. Who are the types of young people that you guys are reaching out to or appealing to?
Yeah, I think in general, the young people we find are the more idealistic ones. As I said, we are a party of values. So people who share our values, people who are committed to Singapore, but they're committed to Singapore that's not the Marina Bay Sands Singapore. This is not the crazy rich Asian Singapore. This is the Singapore of our friends, our family, where we feel that everybody should have an equal opportunity to do well, because we're a rich country. So there's no good reason why, you should have some people who have all the good stuff and everybody else is just dependent on handouts. So I think from the values point of view, we see these people come forward. And like I said, some people come, some people go. And that's fine, as long as they leave with a relatively positive experience of the SDP and of politics. The thing is, we haven't had a town council for a very long time. But once we do get a town council, then you'll see that a lot of people will come forward. That's what happened in 1991. I wasn't involved at the time, but the seniors in the party tell me about it. They said so many people started coming forward, getting involved, and you finally have an office, in the constituency, and you can do something. You have a budget, and you can start to make changes, and then it builds up. See, so that's kind of where we're hoping to go to.
And with GE2025, I'm curious as to what the success looked like for the party.
Well, obviously, real success is when all our candidates get in. But realistically, the chances of that are relatively slim. And I think we're hoping that at least we can get two SMCs and maybe one GRC. And that would be exceeding our expectations. Because, you've heard this already. The Prime Minister strikes fear in people's hearts by saying Trump tariffs and, we need to be united. And we all, the subtext is you all need to vote for PAP, otherwise you're all going to lose your jobs, which is rubbish in my mind. Because, in fact, the fact that, within 48 hours, Trump did a big U-turn, you see. So basically, you cannot follow the old playbook, where you need a so-called strong government to respond to external threats. And so you need to have that flexibility. You need to have that nimbleness. You need to have different voices that you hear. And that's where, having multiple parties in parliament will be good for Singapore.
And I guess that leads to my next question.
Yeah.
How would having the SDP in parliament benefit Singaporeans?
Oh, I think it would be a tremendous help because, there's so many things that people want to be heard about. And the way Parliament in Singapore is structured is that the time given to each MP is very limited. So there's ways you have to put in a private member's bill, or you have to put an amendment, and then you get a certain number of minutes. And the ministers can make a ministerial statement, and they can go on, and time allocated for responses is very limited. So one of the things I think that will happen is that we'll be able to speak up for Singaporeans about these bread and butter issues, but also about civil liberties issues, about issues of freedom of expression, the right of individuals who are marginalized in Singapore to get a seat at the table.
Got it. And my final question for you today
Sure.
is, why should young voters consider voting or supporting the SDP?
Right. I think, as I've said earlier, I think they should support the SDP because we are a compassionate, caring, and constructive party. We have a slate of policies, and we have individuals who are competent, who are able to speak to the needs of Singaporeans, and who are not afraid to do so. And we've proven this time and again over the last 30 years, see, that the SDP is not afraid to speak up for what we feel is right. So I think for a young Singaporean, if you've decided that you don't want to continue with the status quo where, all the money goes to some multinational corporation or some tycoon or to whatever it is, but you feel that everybody in Singapore has a stake in this country, and that we should have an equal opportunity to do well, that we shouldn't be worrying about, the stresses of overpopulation, of climate change, of trying to deal with housing, healthcare, and education. And then, give us a chance. And then you'll see these questions come up in Parliament. And, this is one of the things that we also always say, is that we propose things. I actually asked ChatGPT and DeepSeek to look into the policies of the SDP that the SDP had proposed and were eventually adopted by the PAP, and what was the time lag. And it was amazing. There's some policies that Dr. Chee wrote about in the 1990s about doing away with streaming, and they've finally gone to full subject-based banding. It took 30 years for that to happen. We proposed universal healthcare in 2012, and then MediShield Life came about in 2015. So I think voters can be confident, that if they elect the SDP MP in the Parliament, firstly, the door of the SDP MP will be open, so they'll be able to get their concerns heard. And secondly, this MP will be operating with a base, which is the SDP machinery. There'll be all our change makers, people who have volunteered, people who have the know-how, people who have contributed to our policies, and people who are out there on the ground, reaching out. And so they will get somebody who will make a difference.
Got it. Well, Dr. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think the audience will, find themselves a lot more familiar with the SDP after this one.
Thank you.
I hope this episode was able to give you a deeper understanding of the SDP, who they are, what their values are, and the direction they're charting as we head into GE 2025. Now, as I mentioned before, this is just one dedicated episode to understanding political parties here. If you're curious about the parties, go check out other episodes we have as well. If you appreciate the work we're doing, show us some love by following us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and subscribing on YouTube. We'll see you next episode on Political Prude, the podcast.